Won't dry off, keeps flowing.
Won't dry off, keeps flowing. Won't dry off, keeps flowing. Won't dry off, keeps flowing.
Hello, today I'll tell you a few things about conditional clauses. Now, Mr. Krzyżanowski says in his book at page 222, zapomnijcie o okresach warunkowych. And what does he mean by that? Well, basically that conditionals in English fall into different categories. The ones about the present, future, and the ones about the past, on the one hand. And the real ones describing the situations that have happened or are going to happen, and the unreal ones, the ones that are the exact opposite of that just discuss possibilities. Now, I'm not just gonna give up what I've learned myself. As long as you understand the things that are presented on the screen, it doesn't really matter whether you call them first conditional, third conditional, mixed conditionals, or go with what Mr. Krzyżanowski points out. You should be fine. But apart from knowing what you've got in front of you here, you also need to know this. So you have to learn about inversion in conditional clauses. So instead of if I should see her, you can say should I see her, instead of if I were to choose, were I to choose. That's very elegant English, but Mr. Krzyżanowski will require you to know that, obviously. The same goes for the third type of conditionals, yeah. Pause the recording if need be and just study these carefully. And also study that. That is an example of an emphatic use of but for, or if it weren't for, if it hadn't been for. So instead of the standard, if my mum didn't help me, I wouldn't cope. Well, I hope you understand that it's about now or the future. You can say, if it weren't for my mum, or for my mum's help, or but for my mum's help, I wouldn't cope. And similarly, in the third conditional, instead of saying if my dad hadn't given me the money, you can say if it hadn't been for my dad or for my dad's money or but for my dad's money. Okay, and finally, probably the most surprising thing, Mr. Krzyżanowski points out that there is a thing that he calls, or that he likes to call, real conditionals about past events. So take a look. If she came late, we started late. If he came late, we're still not ready. If they were late, they won't have finished until tomorrow. Now, especially the third one might seem perplexing when you first see it, and you think along the well-trodden path of third conditional, second conditional, and so on. So I think he might have a point here. But on the other hand, is it really a conditional clause? Well, to my mind, if here means something like skoro, so it can be replaced with because or as or since, so it's more like a clause of a result, but who am I to argue? Let's just take a look at the examples that I've selected out of 4 different Olympic papers. Now, there are 12 of them, so that gives us an average of 3 per paper, which just goes to show that you are more than likely to come across some of these problems presented later this year. Okay, do you know how to use unless? I hope you do. The first 2 are by far the simplest examples. So Gibraltar won't be taken over by Spain unless the locals agree or consent to it. So unless means something like if not, it has to be followed by present tense, typically the present simple tense. Similarly, the only person who could maybe make Greg change his diet is his doctor. Greg won't even consider changing his diet unless his doctor says so or tells him to, or something similar again. Right, let's move on and deal with slightly harder ones. So I'd suggest pausing the recording now and having a good think about what forms you would put those verbs in brackets in, and possibly even using pen and paper. But I know very few of you will do that, so beekeeping has been running in the family for generations. I would have started a bee farm long ago if my wife weren't allergic to bee stings. So this one is an example of what we know as a mixed conditional. Mixed in the sense that it's partly about the past and partly about the present. Okay, so the condition is in the present, like my wife is generally allergic to bee stings, and because of that, I haven't started a bee farm yet, so up until now, so partly in the past as well. And the next one is an example that consists in paraphrasing. Again, pause the recording, possibly. The frost hit in the last week of April. Luckily, peach trees started blooming only in May, about 10 days late. So there's going to be a bumper peach harvest this year, meaning a good harvest of peaches, whatever. So if the frost had hit later, this year's expected harvest would be much worse. So the condition is in the past. If it had hit later, at a later time, the harvest, expected harvest, so something that hasn't happened yet or is not ready yet, is in the future, might be much worse or would be much worse. Again, a mixed conditional clause, but I'm using those names really gingerly in case Mr. Krzyżanowski is watching. Okay, the next two examples are illustrations of inversion in conditional clauses. So, as a married woman with 2 small children, Maria had to refuse a very advantageous job offer from a large Swedish IT company. Were Maria single with no kids, she would have taken the offer, or were it not for the fact that Maria was single, or is single, she still is. No, wrong. Were it not for the fact that Maria is a married woman with 2 small children, yeah, in such a case, she would have taken the job, or she might have taken the job. Right, and how about this one? It's pretty tough. It'd be worth pausing the recording now, really. So, had we known the subway was closed, we would have cancelled the appointment. Going by car was no option during the strike, as we soon found out the hard way. So, it's really worth starting from the end here to understand the meaning of the whole passage. Yeah, they learned the hard way that it was a poor option to go by car, because they did go by car. So they did go by car because they didn't know that the subway was closed, and they didn't cancel the appointment. So it has to be a conditional clause, but for some reason it says no we. So if we had known, is not really an option. This is a suggestion that you have to use an inversion. So had we known the subway was closed, we would have cancelled. Okay, so inversion again. And that's Mr. Krzyżanowski's way of suggesting that inversion should be included here. A lot of people thought it along the line of knowing we, well, but that would mean wiedząc, and skoro wiedzieliśmy, and we didn't know about that, so it wasn't an option, really. Okay, so but for is illustrated by the next 2 examples. So the boy who had been pulled into a lion's cage by a huge male would have been dead but for his cold blood and courage. But for, if it hadn't been for, would be an option, but it's not present among the ones presented, so just go for option A, right? And in fact, the school didn't need that additional tennis court. We built it because the tennis association paid for it. So, but for the gift from the tennis association, the school wouldn't have built that additional court. So once again, an unreal conditional clause dealing with past events. And normally, I would suggest the option if it hadn't been for the gift from the tennis association, or if it weren't for the gift from the tennis association. But the thing is, the original gap here was really short. And that's, again, Mr. Krzyżanowski's suggestion that a certain option cannot be used. So the only option here is really but for the gift from. Okay. Sometimes you'll have to deal with partial conditionals, or something that is or works along the lines that you know from your conditional clauses study, but is just somewhat limited or shorter, or does not comprise two typical parts that you would expect of a conditional sentence. So the famous conductor Paolo Tomassi died in a car crash just a week before the highly anticipated concert organized to celebrate his 80th birthday. So the concert to celebrate Tomassi's birthday would have been a great occasion, because it didn't happen. But it was cancelled, or it had to be cancelled after the conductor's sudden death. So a conditional would have been, let's say, well, an unreal past clause rather than a conditional clause. And then it's followed not by a typical if or similar conditional, but by a real clause about the past. So it was cancelled. And dobrze, że się nie spotkaliśmy. Mógłbym powiedzieć coś, czego bym później żałował. It's good we didn't meet. I could have said or might have said something that I and a lot of people went for would regret later, which is wrong because he didn't say that. So would have regretted is again an unreal past situation. So you have to make sure that you make a point of that. And the two last examples are here to show what I've discussed earlier on, namely what Mr. Krzyżanowski calls the real conditionals dealing with the past, or what I call pseudo-conditionals, or really what I consider to be equivalents of the clauses of reason. It's really very alarming. If they were able to control your computer once, they can easily sniff your passwords. So if they were able, czyli skoro byli w stanie. And the last one would be the hardest one. It's a proper combo. It contains a lot of difficult things to deal with. The first one of which happens to be that type of conditional or clause of reason, whatever. So, you ready? If no one else saw the snake slide into the garage, well, maybe Lisa was mistaken. Snakes hibernate in winter, at least in our latitudes. The shape she saw could have been a reflection from the lights of the passing cars. So, skoro nikt inny nie widział, ona widziała, może to nie był wąż. Yeah? If no one else saw the snake slide or sliding, but the key says slide, so emphasis on completion of the action. I'm not sure why. Maybe Lisa was mistaken. Snakes hibernate, a general rule, so the shape she saw could have been or might have been. So a modality of speculation here. How did you like that then? Pretty hard. Well, good luck with your work, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.